On this edition of The Best Times, we visit with a man who has been researching and writing about aging issues for nearly a quarter of a century. Even at age 95, Lester Gingold hasn't stopped learning. Funding for The Best Times is provided by the Plow Foundation, striving to do the greatest good by helping the greatest number of people since 1964. Additional funding is provided by the members of WKNO. Thank you. Hello, I'm Chris Hardaway. Welcome to this edition of The Best Times, a series that looks at life after 50. You're probably familiar with the Best Times newspaper, the namesake for this show. And you may have seen its founding publisher, Lester Gingold, on this show before. By way of introducing him, I'd like to tell you a story that he told me. Last year, when Lester was just 94 years old, he was looking out the window of his home, watching cars speeding up and down the street. Now, he lives in a quiet East Memphis neighborhood on a relatively narrow street with no sidewalks. Lester saw a problem and knew that he was the man to fix it. The answer was speed bumps, but the city requires 75% of the residents within the neighborhood to approve the installation. So for 2 months, Lester went door to door, petition in hand, making his case for speed bumps to every resident. In the end, 100% of his neighbors signed his petition. I'd like you to meet Lester Gingold. Lester Gingold was born in Birmingham, Alabama on New Year's Day in 1922. After graduating from Birmingham Southern College, he promptly went to war with the combat engineers in the European theater. After the war, he began a 34-year career as general merchandise manager with Sears. Lester has been extremely active in many civic organizations in the city and has applied his marketing expertise to such events as the Cotton Carnival. At age 59, with a successful business career behind him, he retired from Sears, but that didn't last long. The commercial appeal coaxed him to become advertising director for the paper, a position he occupied for 13 years. His second retirement at age 72 didn't last long either. He took over the reins of a publication called Active Times, which soon became The Best Times, and was not just his encore career, but was, and still is, his passion. Lester, you've spent probably the last 2 or 3 decades dealing with aging issues. I can't think of a better expert on aging here locally, but tell me, what do you think the challenges are that we face as a country and as an aging population?
Well, I think the challenges have never been greater than they are today. If we look at the demographics, we're the fastest growing segment of the population. And especially those who are the oldest old, which is now those 85 and older, which I now qualify for, become even more interested. In fact, it's interesting, your question to begin with is something that I'd plan to perhaps go to the new president and say, I think we need to do more than we did with the White House Conference on Aging. I attended that, which takes place every decade. John Kennedy started that. He said we would call the people to Washington and discuss the aging issues because this is going to be a problem for the future. And that's John Kennedy speaking. The challenges for the aging is the fact that we talk about friendly communities, friendly places to live. The challenge is to fight ageism. Well, how do we make our community a friendlier place? That's one of the personal goals that I still am trying to accomplish here for Memphis.
Yeah, how do we age in place?
How do we age successfully
Yes.
here in Memphis? Are we a safer city? Are we a city that has mobility problems taken care of so the aging can get around as they need to? Do we have problems of ageism? Do we have problems of financial literacy that aging people don't understand? We have all these challenges for the aging, and what kind of an operation, what kind of a city do we have? I think I'm going to probably ask the mayor if he would set up here in Memphis and bring in the mayors of all the surrounding towns, go as far as Jackson for that matter, or others, and say, let's make this a friendly city for the future, and what we can do in the field of aging, and bring in those experts that we can get nationally as well as regionally and locally, and make plans for Memphis for the next 10, 15, and 20 years. And those are plans that has to be made.
I get the sense from you that you feel like we haven't done enough as a city, as a state,
right.
as a country.
We certainly haven't done enough as far as I'm concerned.
What one area would you identify that more than any other that we should work on?
I would guess the fact that of lifetime learning, people in there, I didn't even want to be identified as a senior when I started when I was 50 or 60 or 70 years old.
Well, of course not.
But people in senior centers today are those who are probably in their 70s and 80s. They're not those in the 50s or 60s, and we're still talking retirement. But the challenges for those people to have successful and graceful aging becomes a significant thing. I think back to my own life, into when I really felt most significant in the changes in my life. I retired my first job. I was 59 years old. I took an early retirement from Sears. I'd been there 34 years. So then I had a call from the Commercial Appeal. They said, Lester, we'd like you to come down as a consultant. After 2 or 3 weeks, I was called into the publisher's office. He said, Lester, he said, we'd like to make you advertising manager. I said, I thought I was just going to be here as a consultant. He said, well, we'd like you to be the advertising manager. And I said, that sounds all right to me. So I started with that. And then maybe a year later, he came back to me, Lester, we'd like to make you advertising director, responsible for all the revenue. Now, at that time, I'm 65, 60 years old. And I said, that's even more exciting.
Let me ask you about retirement, because you did have, as you just outlined, many opportunities to retire, but you never did. Why did you choose to keep on working? Because
I have a philosophy that you have to have a challenge every day and every moment you wake up in the morning. And you have to have something to do, and something can be productive and make you feel like you're meeting a challenge for the day. And every single day that I have awakened, I had something to do and a challenge to get it done. And I felt this was significant in my first career, my second career. So then I got a call from MIFA. And at the time they said, Lester, we have a little publication here called Active Times. Can you come over and tell us what to do with it? I said, listen, I know all about it. I know all about all media. I've been studying every single publication for years. And I said, I think I'd have an interest in it. So with that, I went with Barney Dubois at the business newspaper, and we bought it, started Active Times. And that was the beginning of the best times. We did that.
For how many years did you do that?
Well, that was 18 years. When I started that and began that career, I felt it was necessary to understand aging and gerontology. And I started my study of gerontology at that time. So that gave me the initial purpose of learning something in a new field. So even though it was journalism, it gave me an opportunity to learn something new and different. And I started my study of gerontology, which is different than geriatrics, as you know. But gerontology is something I started studying then. And I guess I became, quote, an expert because I was one of the few people doing just that.
Yes. Now, you finally did retire from
Yes.
the best times. What age were you when you retired?
Well, that's interesting. I don't think I retired then.
You're not going to admit to retiring?
Well, I was thinking about retiring, and I was 91 years old. And I guess the most productive time I had was maybe the last decade of my life. People say that you start getting dull at 80. I don't believe it. So here I was at 91, still going strong, getting to work every day at 8 o'clock, beating everybody there, being there on Saturdays, sometimes on Sundays, and really being involved in it. And then one day, I was going to a meeting, a retirement village, and there I tripped, fell, and broke my shoulder. When that happened, all of a sudden, I couldn't get to the office the next day or the next week, and I started my rehab. And that kind of forced me into the point, well, maybe it is time that I need to slow down a little bit. And that's what happened. And so then I was 91 years old, 92 at the time, and when I finally retired from that. So now we're almost into the third year.
Yeah, you're 3 years into retirement. What's it like? What's retirement like?
Well, as long as you have purpose every day, still, it's all right.
How do you find that?
But if you don't have purpose, retirement is a horrible time
Well,
in life.
what's the purpose for you in retirement?
The purpose of me is to have goals and to meet them. For example, in driver safety, in addition to that, I had felt that the fact that Memphis was, I think, the 6th or 7th highest pedestrian fatality rate in America. Why? And then I thought, as I looked around and tried to cross the street with my cane, with the signal changing so rapidly, I said, there's something wrong here. So it became a challenge to me. But at that time, I felt it was perhaps unsafe for me to drive. So with that, I started my research, finding every day what was happening in the field of aging to people who could no longer drive. That, to me, has been one of the most difficult things that have happened to me, more than retirement. Just giving up the keys to the car.
Yes. It's hard. It's hard.
But then the other thing, one of the other challenges was, I still write a column for the Best Times every month. And there's so many still subjects to write about. I wrote about the subject of having a ethical will that I think so much about. And I wrote my editorial, felt that it was a good one. And then at a prayer breakfast, a man came up to me, he said, Lester, he said, I want to let you, what a difference that's made. He said, I made copies of that. He said, every member of my family, even those who are 30 and 40 years old, are now writing ethical wills. Gosh, if you don't think that made me feel like I've accomplished something, it did, and it gave me another challenge. So what's my challenge for tomorrow? It's always having something that I can think very favorably on that was going to be productive for me and for someone else as well.
It sounds to me like you haven't really retired. You've just become a political activist.
Absolutely.
Let's go back to your time in the newspaper business. I know you've reported on many, many stories. You've met a lot of different people. Who are the big stories? Who are some of the, or what are the big stories?
Well, one of the big stories was when John Glenn went into space for the second time. John Glenn, you know, as an older man, this was a major news story. He was the first man, you know, that was in space. Mm-hmm. So when I heard that he was going, I said, gosh, how can I get approval for coverage of that event? So I made it early, made contacts, and I got approved as a member of the press to attend the liftoff for John Glenn. I went down to Cape Canaveral for that, met and had pictures made with all the astronauts, and it was just an exciting occasion. Then I got a call from WREG-TV. Said, Lester, we could not get permission to come to the scene. Can you meet us across the bay here for an interview? So I hate to say it, but that was really kind of thrilling. The fact that I had made it and an established TV station could not make it. But at that particular time, Walter Cronkite and I were the two oldest journalists there. And so I was interviewed by ABC and CNN, and they took a picture of me sitting next to a 12-year-old student who was writing for Scholastic News. And they said, here's the oldest and the youngest attendant. But anyway, that was one of my stories.
Now, you've met a lot of presidents in your time.
Well, one of the most exciting, well, I've had a couple exciting things with presidents. I was making, during my whole career with Sears, in addition to that, I was making motivational talks. And I would make speeches to groups of anywhere from 50 to 1,500 people. When I was making my speech in Kansas City, I spoke with some of the members of the club that was sponsoring me there. I said, gosh, what's the opportunity or the chance of meeting President Truman, who lives in Independence, Missouri, which is a suburb? And they said, let's do it. Tell you a secret. Tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, if you will go to his mailbox, he will be there to pick up his newspaper. I said, I'll be there. So the next morning at 6 o'clock, I'm in Independence, Missouri. Mailbox, the house is about, maybe 100 yards from the mailbox. I see this character walking out here in a blue and gray robe and house slippers. He gets to the corner, and I hand him the newspaper. I said, here, Mr. President, your paper. He laughed. He said, who are you? And I said, I'm Lester Gingo, who is President Truman. I said, I'm here to make a speech tonight to 1,500 people. And I thought, since you're an old retailer, you could tell me some successful things to tell them about how to sell. He laughed. He said, tell them to be honest. Tell them to be sincere. Tell them just to mean what they say. He said, now, I'd invite you in for coffee, except Margaret's still asleep. So you come back sometime. That was one visit.
You know, that is, as you were telling that, it occurred to me, that's a scene that could never happen today. Never.
Right.
Well, I mean, what president goes out to the mailbox to pick up his newspaper these days? So.
Well, the other thing with the president was Lyndon Johnson. I was the incoming president of Cotton Carnival. Now they call it Memphis Carnival. And I wanted to do something very special. And I said, it'd be very interesting if we could get some tie-in with the president to come to Memphis for the carnival. Well, everybody said, well, that's impossible. I said, well, maybe we could take the king and queen to the White House. They said, that's impossible too. I said, no, it's not. So I worked on that with the senators and the governor. Buford Ellingen was governor at the time. And I worked out a deal to arrange for the King and Queen of Carnival to visit the Oval Office in Washington. Well, that was set up for 2 or 3 months in advance. We get to Washington for this meeting in the Oval Office. We're at the Madison Hotel. We're gathered around with the King and Queen of Carnival and their parents. So there we are, and the Secret Service comes by to interview us. They wanted to make sure that all would be safe and secure. And I said, and by the way, I said to them, you know the king and queen will be in costume. They said, oh no. No one goes to the Oval Office in costume. I said, well, that spoils the whole trip. I said, unless we have the king and queen in costume with the president,
there's no photo opportunity there.
So finally, after 2 hours, they finally got permission for the king and queen to go to the Oval Office. So the next day, we go to the Oval Office. The king and queen are there in their beautiful costumes, and we're waiting for the president to walk in. So they came in, took our pictures. We had the king and queen there. And then Lyndon turns to me and he said, Lester, he said, we got a special speaker today at the joint sessions of Congress, General Westmoreland. He's just returned and is going to be speaking. Would you like to go and take a couple people? I said, you bet I would. And he said, who? I said, the king and queen. And with that, he picks up the phone. He says, get a car here for Mr. Gingo. So I go downstairs, the king and queen in costume. We go to Congress. They put us on the front row of the balcony where normally the president's wife and other dignitaries normally sit. So here I'm sitting with these two people in beautiful costumes, and all the congressmen and senators are looking up, and Westmoreland's about to speak. Well, Westmoreland makes his talk. And with that, I took the king and queen to the floor of Congress. Everyone wanted their pictures taken with them. All the senators, all the congressmen. They didn't care what country they came from. They wanted their pictures taken with the king and queen. So that's two of my president stories.
Is there a favorite story that you've reported on in your career?
I guess perhaps the story that wrote and kept most attention, and believe it or not, still gets attention today. It was 1945, October. I was in Mannheim, Germany, awaiting reassignment. This is World War II now. Awaiting reassignment, I didn't know where I would be going to. And someone came to my room and said, "Lester, there's been a serious accident up at the corner. And it looks like beside the stars on the side of the car, it must be a general." I had never taken pictures before in my life. I turned to a fellow, I said, "Do you have a camera?" He said, "I got a Browning here." I said, "Loan it to me." I took it, and I walked 4 blocks away, and here was this Cadillac limousine, an 8-passenger limousine that had been crushed against a truck, a 2.5-ton truck. And I took my pictures of that, looked inside, saw 2 bottles of whiskey there, scotch, saw the dog's blanket there, saw the blood on the floor. And then I saw the 2.5-ton truck. And walking toward me was a young man with his hat askew, his uniform askew. He says, and I had my camera, and he says, "Don't take my picture." And with that, with my hand in the air, I took his picture. That became the only picture taken of the man who drove the truck that killed Patton. And I wrote about that. And then as a result of that, I called Stars and Stripes in Berlin. I said, "I got a good story for you." I said, "The general has been in an accident here." And I said, "I've got pictures." And they said, they didn't know at the time. He said, "It couldn't be too serious or we'd have heard about it. But we'll send our own photographer there. Don't worry." I said, "Okay." Anyway, it was less than 25 days later that Patton died. And I went to Patton's funeral. It was a small Episcopal church. And it was just a very moving event, even for the Germans who were there. And that was concluded that, I thought. And I thought that was the end of it. Well, they started writing books about the death of Patton and how this perhaps had been an assassination. And there had been literally 100 books that had been written on this subject. But one of the books that was written about 10 years ago contacted me. They had heard about the fact that I was there and asked for permission to use those pictures in the book. And I said, "Well, those pictures are now in the Patton Museum in Los Angeles." I said, "Well, I'll give you permission to use them." So the book was published called Target Patton. And those pictures appear in it. And in the cut lines, the credit lines at the front of the book, they credit different people who appeared in the book. Of course, they got Churchill, they got Eisenhower, and they've got Gingold. So
You're in good company, aren't you?
But just recently, it's less than a month ago, I got a phone call from California, the man who had done the research on the Patton's death. He said, "Lester," he said, "you gave me those pictures originally, that was some time ago. Do you remember whether or not the window was open on the right side of the car?" They still thought that someone had shot Patton.
Still searching for the conspiracy,
That's right.
aren't they? Well, Lester, you've made it to 95. You've had an extraordinary life. The poets tell us that wisdom comes with age, so give me your words of wisdom.
You're never too old to learn. You're never too old to love. You're never too old to pray. I do more of these every day. That's it.
Those are good words to live by. Thank you for being on the Best Times.
Thank you.
Want more information about life after 50? Go online to watch more shows and find more resources. And send us your feedback and story ideas to besttimes@wkno.org. That's all for this edition of The Best Times. Please join us next week for more stories about life after 50. Until then, I'm Chris Hardaway. Thanks for watching. Good night. Funding for The Best Times is provided by the Plow Foundation, striving to do the greatest good by helping the greatest number of people since 1964. Additional funding is provided by the members of WKNO. Thank you.